Thanks, and again, thanks everybody for joining us for this webinar today. Our first speaker is going to be Lucila Bloemendaal. Lucila is a 2021 Knauss Fellow working in NOAA Coast Survey and supporting the National Ocean Mapping, Exploration, and Characterization Council as one of the Executive Secretariat. She is a PhD candidate at Boston University studying coastal geology and salt marsh morphology. She primarily studies East Coast salt marshes and previously did research in paleoceanography at Duke University, where she earned her bachelor's degree. And so Lucila, take it away with her presentation titled What Controls Salt Marsh Edge Erosion and Salt Marsh Resilience. So Lucila, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Kim, and thanks for the introduction and opportunity to present here. Today I'll be presenting about a study that was published this year, actually, about salt marsh edge erosion and thus kind of marsh resilience. And I wanted to start this presentation with this picture I took doing some field work in the marshes of South Carolina, where we were very lucky to see a dolphin pass by us in the channel. And I really like this picture because it just highlights how beautiful salt marsh systems are, as well as how important they are. They serve a lot of biodiversity and other ecosystem services. So starting off, a little basic, what are salt marshes? They are systems that occur in the upper coastal intertidal zone between land and salt or brackish water. There's this neat animation from NOAA showing how as the tide rises, the salt marsh floods, and as the tide goes down, it drains. And so because of this very dynamic system, the salt marshes are dominated by salt-tolerant plants. And as the tide comes in and brings sediment in, the plants trap these sediments and then use it to grow vertically in a process called vertical accretion. Salt marsh plants can also grow laterally, expand, and colonize mudflats in the channels and grow the marsh laterally or horizontally. Because of the dynamic system where the tides really kind of rule in the marsh systems, we tend to divide them into distinct zones based on elevation, so based on how frequently they get flooded by the tides. So we have high marsh and low marsh. As you'd expect, low marsh sits a little lower in elevation and gets flooded pretty frequently. It sits below the mean high water level. And high marsh gets flooded a little less frequently. And because of this distinct frequency of flooding, they harbor distinct flora and fauna species. And so why are marshes important? Besides being really cool, they provide a bunch of ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration. They provide storm protection by attenuating wave energy and dissipating the waves. They are an important nutrient exchange with the coastal ocean, nursery grounds for aquatic species, among many other things. So they're really important. They enhance not just ecosystem resilience, but our resilience too. And so we would like to keep them around for a while longer. And so to do that, we have to understand why we're losing them right now, why they're eroding. That leads us into edge erosion. Edge erosion is the loss of marsh horizontally or laterally. So the loss of marsh bank or marsh edge and the expansion of channels in open water areas. It's a major driver of marsh degradation and loss. It occurs through two main ways: mass failure, where big chunks of the marsh bank come off, slump off, kind of like halving of icebergs, as well as a more continuous type of erosion where particle by particle or piece of sediment by piece of sediment, the waves or something else dislodges the sediment and slowly starts eroding the marsh edge and makes it retreat backwards. Previous studies have identified several factors impacting this type of edge erosion. A big one is local and storm wave climate, where the waves kind of pound at the marsh bank and dislodge the sediment, as well as waves can undercut the bank. So the waves hit the bottom half of the bank and cut into it while the top part of the marsh bank still sticks out. And this causes an instability or an unstable vertical profile that can promote this kind of mass failure where it kind of eventually just topples over because there's nothing holding the top of it up. In addition to waves, vegetation and substrate characteristics and geotechnical properties can play a role in erosion. So the roots and how strong the sediment is held together makes it maybe less erodible or less prone to erosion by waves. And then vice versa, weaker sediments or weaker soils or marsh banks that are held less together they might be a little more erodible. So this affects the erodibility of it. Sea level rise, unfortunately, will also increase edge erosion because as water depths increase with sea level rise, wave heights increase and wave energies increase. And so they can batter the marsh banks a little more strongly and cause this type of edge erosion. So we looked at edge erosion in New England in a beautiful marsh system called the Great Marsh in Massachusetts. We looked specifically at the Plum Island Essex Bay marshes. You can see here in this little inset where it lies within Massachusetts, quite far up north by the Gulf of Maine. And the tidal range here is 2.6 to 2.8 meters across the system, which is pretty large. For comparison, some systems around the DC area can be within just centimeters of the tidal range. As you can see in the picture here, the waters are pretty clear and it's a pretty sandy system. There's very low suspended sediment input. So there's not much sediment coming in with the tides that the plants are then trapping and then using to grow vertically. The marsh is pretty high elevation and it's mostly dominated by high marsh, dominated by a couple of distinct grass species. And the sea level rise is around 2.9 millimeters per year based on the Boston Harbor tidal gauge there. And this is just to orient you on what the physical system looks like in this marsh system, but it's a pretty typical East Coast marsh system. It's just really big. And so the objective this study was to just understand edge erosion. The objective was to determine the relationships among marsh edge type, so the type of erosion we see or the lack of erosion we see, geotechnical properties of marsh edges, so how erodible or not erodible the marsh edge was, fetch, which is a proxy for wave energy. Fetch is just the distance a wave can travel over open water uninterrupted until it hits something like the marsh bank. And so the longer the fetch, the larger the wave usually, and also how these factors are related to marsh edge erosion. So basically, we try to measure many different things and try to find any relationships or trends among them. And so to start, we mapped the whole marsh system. By foot or by boat, we mapped the marsh edge and classified it into 4 different categories. The first is slumping, which is an eroding edge that is occurring mostly through mass failure, so big slump blocks just calving off of the marsh bank, as you can see here in panel A. Also, we saw vertical and abrading marsh edges. So these edges were vertical and there weren't really many slump blocks, but it was still eroding. There was also bedrock or large gravel, as you can see in panel C. This area does have some outcrops and rocks are relatively less eroded or less easily eroded than the marsh themselves. So these are pretty stable marsh edges. And then we also had the final category, stable edge or an accretionary edge. So these edges were not eroding and some of them were even growing. They were colonizing mudflats or expanding horizontally. And then using this system of categorization, we mapped over 110 kilometers of the marsh edge. And then in that marsh edge of every 100 meters, we also measured fetch distances for several wind directions. So in this region, the prevailing wind direction, so the most common wind direction comes from the south. And so we measured fetch every 100 meters from at the marsh edge, how long that fetch was in the south direction, as well as the 2 storm directions that frequently, the waves frequently batter the marsh banks from these directions because they tend to create really strong waves. And then for fun, we kind of looked at the longest distance fetch as well, just to see if there was a relationship there. In addition to that, we went out in the field again and went to 98 sites and measured in situ properties as well as took samples. So this is a cross section of the marsh bank where this is the top of the marsh and all the way down to the bottom of the marsh bank. And here in the field, we using a shear vane, somewhat similar to this one, we took shear strength measurements in situ. So every 20 centimeters down from the top of the marsh bank down to the bottom, we stuck a shear vane in there 20 centimeters in, measured the shear strength, and then did the same 40 centimeters in. In addition to that, we took samples of the marsh sediment every 20 centimeters down, and then took that back into the lab to measure for biomass, organic content, and bulk density, as these geotechnical properties are parameters pretty often cited as ones that affect edge erosion. To make a comparison across the different sites a little easier, we converted the depths down the marsh bank to elevation relative to NAVD 88 as well as elevation relative to mean sea level, which would make things a little more intuitive to understand. And so we looked at all these parameters, compared the relationships in every combination you can imagine, and here are the results. This is what our map of the marsh edge looks like. The different colors represent the 4 different categories that we classified the marsh edge. So white is bedrock or large gravel, and you can see only very little parts of the marsh actually have outcrops sticking out. Orange is slumping, so it's an eroding edge that is primarily through mass failure or these big slump blocks. Green is stable or accretionary, so not eroding. And then yellow is vertical and abrading, so eroding but not through slump blocks, it's just abrading. And you can see here on first glance that there is really no spatial trend that you see in the types of edge that that are present. So you'd expect the edge right by really small channels where there are no waves essentially to be quite stable and not eroding. And you do see stable or accretionary edges in these tiny channels, but you also see stable and accretionary edges in these really big open water areas where they do get exposed to some pretty strong waves. On the flip side, you can also see eroding edges in these really small channels, as well as in these big open water exposed areas. So on first glance, there doesn't seem to be a relationship between wave exposure and the type of edge or the type of this distribution of edge erosion that we see. And this is further confirmed by looking at fetch. So each of these plots show fetch for the different wave directions that we measured. And then the different colors of the box and whisker plots are the different marsh edge categories. So we have bedrock and large gravel, slumping, which is eroding, stable or accretionary, and vertical and abrading, which is also eroding. So these green and purple box and whisker plots are the eroding edges. And you'd expect if, fetch as a proxy of wave energy is a big factor in the edges that are eroding, you'd expect that these box and whisker plots are significantly different than the stable or accretionary edges, but you don't really see that. You don't see any trends with fetch for the type of edge class that we see. So the main takeaway here is that we see no trends, which is really interesting and unexpected. And then moving on to the geotechnical properties, these kind of intense graphs show each geotechnical property. So x-axis here shows organic content, bulk density, below ground biomass, shear strengths, and the y-axis is elevation. And this basically just shows each geotechnical property and its trends with elevation. And the error bars are standard error, and using some statistical tests, we found that there really is no significant difference in elevation for each of these properties. And so previous studies have suggested that, maybe lower down in the marsh bank, the sediment can be weaker, the peat's weaker, and that weakness allows it to be eroded more easily by waves, which causes undercutting in that unstable vertical profile I mentioned, which can kind of enhance erosion through mass failure. We don't really see that. And these are the means for all the 98 sites we measured, but we also in the paper separated into we separated these graphs into, okay, what does the slumping edge look like? What does a stable or accretionary edge look like? And we didn't really see any trends there either, which is also very interesting. And then finally, these are just some more geotechnical property plots showing the probability density functions of each of the properties. And this is just to show the big spread in values that we saw. So at the 98 sites we went to, and we took measurements every 20 simmers down those sites, so over around 400 samples. The organic content ranged from around 5% to 50%. A below ground biomass around close to 0 to 30%. And so this is just showing how heterogeneous the marsh is and how there really is no characteristic geotechnical property identified in the marsh, at least not at such a big scale as a whole marsh system. And that leads us into the discussion and conclusions, where the trends and there are no trends, and the marsh is very heterogeneous. The geotechnical properties have no trends, and that highlights the complexity of marsh systems and the drivers of edge erosion. We found no relationships except for shear strength 40 centimeters into the bank. And so with this relationship, we found that vertical and abrading edges have significantly higher shear strengths than stable and accretionary edges, which is very interesting because you'd expect an eroding edge to maybe be weaker than a stable or accretionary edge, but we see the contrary here. And that's kind of contrary to previous studies that say that edge erosion is led because of weaker soil strengths or something like that. And we also found no significant trends with elevation, and this panel kind of just highlights that. And so there is no unstable vertical profile that we see that promotes bank failure or undercutting. So basically, we couldn't replicate or see trends that previous studies have found, but the study that we conducted was so much bigger. It was the scale of the whole marsh, while previous studies looked at a few sites or did idealized modeling studies. So it was really interesting and unexpected that we didn't see any trends, but this just shows how complex the marsh is and how heterogeneous it is and how much noise there is in the data. And so same with fetch and edge erosion. We didn't see any significant difference in fetch among the different edge classes. As you can see in the panel here, the box and whisker plots show there's no, that they really overlap. Fetch is kind of the same in each type of edge that you see. So a slumping edge faces the same kind of fetch as a stable or accretionary edge. And if you remember the map of the edge of the edge that we made, you can kind of see that there were no spatial trends really. So open water edges and really protected edges alike kind of experienced the same type of erosion or lack of erosion. So the big takeaway is that typical parameters measured in edge erosion studies cannot explain the presence, type, and distribution of edge erosion. So in the study, we looked at the most typical parameters, and we couldn't untangle anything from that. And so the main conclusions were, because of heterogeneities in marsh edges, we found no relationship among geotechnical properties, fetch, and the presence of edge erosion. We found no relationship at all in anything, really. Marsh edges that experience open water waves and marsh edges that are in sheltered areas alike can erode, and the geotechnical properties at an edge are no indicator of edge erosion. The one helpful thing about a study where we took so many samples at so many sites is that we provide a range of values for geotechnical properties at marsh edges that can be used for modeling studies. The study also shows that assigning a single or handful of values to marsh edge properties does not accurately encompass the heterogeneity found in a marsh and may skew modeling results. So most modeling studies can say, oh, the organic content is around 10 to 15%, so we'll constrain it there and see what happens. But this really shows that each site that we visited is so incredibly different. And even within a site, the variability is huge. When we took samples at the top of the marsh versus a sample 20 centimeters below, just 20 centimeters below, it could be wildly different. And this is also an artifact of how we sampled. So we took discrete samples at each sampling point. And so that, if you hit a root that in one place, that can show really large biomass or really high shear strength compared to a right next to it where there is no root. But overall, on average, there were no trends there. It was just very noisy. And so finally, the parameters or interactions beyond the ones typically measured may also be responsible for edge erosion, or likely responsible for edge erosion. And these relationships are not captured by current field and modeling studies. So like winter processes like freeze thaw or wetting and drying cycles, or even tidal currents can maybe interact in this complex way that is a driver for edge erosion. I really believe that, these systems are real and natural and complex, and we can't really distill what's happening with just a few parameters that have predictive value. It really is an interaction of everything, which makes studying it really difficult, but really interesting too. And so the next steps with this study is to kind of look at it in a more quantifiable way. So we're doing a shoreline change analysis and using RTK GPS measurements over many years to calculate retreat rates. And we're trying to relate these retreat rates with actual wave energies instead of just using fetch as a proxy for wave energy. So you're doing some hydrodynamic modeling to see what the marsh edges really experience in an idealized setting, and seeing if there's any relationship or predictive power there. And so that was the gist of the presentation, but there was so much more in the study that I could not include here. So feel free to look at the paper, or I'm happy to send it as well. And I'd like to thank NOAA Sea Grant and the Knauss Fellowship for the opportunity to present and be here, as well as the towns of Newbury and Essex, where we conducted our field work, and Sarah, Trenton, and Kate for helping with data collection, as well as all the grants that funded this research and funded me during my PhD. And with that, I ended a little early, but I am happy to answer any questions. And if you have questions after this, you can contact me at the email at the bottom of the slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucila. I appreciate your presentation. Audience, we're going to take the next, let's see, about 8 minutes to answer your questions. So please type them in the questions chat box and I will read them to our speaker. We've started getting some questions. So before I start, I just want to remind you that Lucila has provided her slides as a handout. So if you're interested, please download them from the handouts menu in the GoToWebinar control panel. So Lucila, we have a couple questions. The first one that came in asks, how many linear miles were sampled?
Sorry, I accidentally muted myself. That's a really good question. I measured it in kilometers, but it was around over 110 kilometers of actual border. So linear miles, that's a really good question. I'd have to look at the maps and get back to you on that. But it was a lot of walking and a lot of boat time.
Excellent. Did you find more slumping associated with the storm events?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question and something that we're trying to parse through now as well, because there are chunks of the marsh that even in the years that we've collected samples or conducted surveys, they're degrading really fast and slumping, and you get these potholes and everything that kind of accelerate that slumping. We have not, or I have not gone immediately after a storm event to look at the change in slump blocks, but I think there are indications that storms really do kind of provide that extra push to make a piece of block that's almost calving off to fully calved off. And then it takes a really long time for these blocks to fully disintegrate once they calve off. So they actually can sometimes provide a bit of protection from future storms, where these big blocks sit in front of the marsh banks and then kind of are the first barrier of the waves before they hit the bank. So really interesting relationships and dynamics there that still need to be studied further. It's just hard getting there during a storm and maybe right after a storm, since things tend to be a little flooded.
Thank you. Next question asks, can you speculate as to what factors are responsible for the erosion, since all the factors you looked at did not seem to be the cause?
Yeah, that's the question we're trying to answer, I guess. I think it's just a really complex system, and a really understudied area are winter processes. So things that happen in the winter when things are frozen over and ice rafts kind of jam in there and everything. Once again, it's really hard to study. It's really cold in the winter and very inaccessible. So that, I think, is a promising area to look into. But I can't say for sure what's going on. Like I said, there are potholes happening. So it's also an interaction of what's happening at the top of the marsh as well as what's happening at the edge. So it's all connected, and it's kind of hard to recreate that and try to make some studies to look at all of it together.
Yeah, this next question is similar. It says, since you didn't find any relationships with typical variables that are modeled, would you investigate other factors you think might lead to the unexpected heterogeneity?
Yeah, so our lab is looking at the stuff that's happening at the top of the marsh platform, so ponding, potholes, and things like that, changing ecology and hydrology. All these things are very likely contributing to what's going on the edge. And so stay tuned for any studies and papers that come out of there.
I hope they'll be in the library. Great presentation / study. Will you be looking at possible relationships between marsh edge erosion and hydrodynamics in the Sound?
Yeah, so I'm currently working on some hydrodynamic modeling there on how that's affecting the marsh edge, but someone else in our lab is also looking at the sediment transport and movement hydrodynamics of the bay and the channels themselves, and how these shoals move and how that sediment availability or lack of availability affects the marsh edge or the marsh platform, and how all of those things are connected. Sounds like a complicated picture, but also stay tuned for that. I looked at mostly the marsh edge and the geotechnical properties, but there's certainly a lot going on in the channel that affects this. And once the marsh edge gets eroded, that sediment goes into the channel maybe, and there's studies showing that some of that might be brought through the tides back up to the marsh platform and providing sediment for vertical accretion. So there's kind of a cycle happening there. But yeah, further studies are needed, of course.
Wonderful. This next question asks, are the categories used from a standardized protocol, or did you make them up? This could be a quick way to assess marsh edge condition across a large spatial scale.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think the categorization, there was a complicated, lengthy thought process going in there. Other studies have used very similar classification systems, but a mesotidal marsh exhibits different edges from a microtidal marsh, for example. But we looked at a more complex classification scheme that looked at how much algae there is on it and like separating the slump block classification into more fine classification. But this ended up being the kind of sweet spot of simplicity and where we can actually parse out trends maybe, but also encompassing the complexity of what's going on. But it's an ever-growing system and changing, so it would be interesting to see how this can compare with all the other marshes too.
This next person says, thank you so much, Lucila. Just wondering if you observed higher vessel traffic in some areas that may cause wake effects or higher herbivory from grazers, for example, geese.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I've been thinking about wakes too. We tend to get wakes in the small channels where people actually launch their boats, but there really was no relationship between the edge we were seeing, whether it was eroding or not, and that. But I haven't quantified it yet. But I know there are studies out there that have tried to. And herbivory is a really big field of study, I think, especially in this marsh, looking at not just geese. I don't see that many geese where my study sites are, but also crabs and everything, and the burrows they make, and does that enhance or reduce erosion? There are a lot of questions there, and that's why it's great to have other scientists like ecologists on the team too, to kind of get that big picture.
Great. This is going to have to be our last question. I really appreciate everybody's questions, and I will forward them to Lucila. But this last question asks, did you do an analysis looking at whether marsh accretion was keeping up with erosion?
Ooh, good question. And my PI definitely has, and it's not looking like it might be. It's a tough question, but I am happy to send out papers to whoever asks about that too. It's not looking good for a few of the marsh systems out there.
Wonderful. So thank you very much, Lucila, for fielding all those questions and your presentation.